What's good, YouTube? Welcome to another Small James coding tutorial where today we're going to be covering 8 must-know advanced Tailwind features to help you be a better Tailwind developer today and also just impress everyone with your excellent styling skills. So the techniques that we're going to be covering today is the first hover and group hover, then pseudo elements, breakpoints and screen sizes, custom inputs, dynamic inputs, animations, grid and flexbox, and then finally hidden versus inline. Incorporating all of them into your Tailwind capabilities is just going to be massively beneficial to your overall coding experience, and I definitely recommend giving them all a shot. If you learned something or enjoy the video, please like and sub, super appreciate it. Let's get into it. So here I have a React application with Vite and Tailwind. If you want to know how to set that up, there's a link in the description for the configuration. And the first technique, advanced technique that we're going to be covering is the group and hover effect. And so obviously the way that that works, if I come in here and start off by giving this min height screen flex call justify center items center, anything that I put in here will be in the center. And now I can have a button, and that can have a class name and a background of white and a text of slate 900 and maybe like a padding of 10. So now if I type in here button, we should have that pop up smack bang in the middle, and it does, which is perfect. And that should actually just be P10. And a common effect that you see on buttons is to have a hover element. And so we can have a hover, let's just say we go opacity 50. So now when I hover over this button, the opacity changes. And you know, I could set a duration to that effect of 300 milliseconds. And so now when I hover over this button, it gradually fades out and fades back in. But what if in here we also had, let's say, a secondary div? So I'm going to enter this onto a new line, pop this inside of an h1 tag, just so I can separate the elements like that. And now let's also add a flex items center and a gap of 4. So this is going to allow me to add an icon, but in this particular case, I'm just going to do a span that's just going to have a class of height 4, width 4, background amber 800. So now we have that little square there, and this can just be representative of an icon, and I'm just going to make that a bit bigger. So we are hovering on this effect, and you know, the example might be if you have a little chevron pointing down, so that little V pointing down, you might want on hover for that element to rotate. However, I can come in here and add hover rotate. You know, let's say we make it 45 degrees, so it's pretty obvious. Now that rotates, but we want it to actually rotate when we hover over the parent element. And this is where the group hover effect comes in handy, because what we can do, let's just add a duration of 300 on here, is we can, on the parent element, add the term group, and in here we can say group hover. And now we'll see that when we hover over the parent element, it in turn rotates the child icon element. So if you had the chevron, that might flip upside down. And so just by adding the group term to the parent element and the group dash in front of the hover element, we can make the hover events happen when we're not specifically targeting, or you know, our mouse doesn't hover over this particular icon or whatever it may be. So that is the first effect, and the second thing we're going to do is look at pseudo effects, and for that what I'm going to do is set my background to white, and I'm actually going to add a border to this particular element. And the way that we can do that is by setting a relative to this element. Now that is important because a pseudo element typically has a position of absolute, and it will absolute position it according to wherever the nearest parent with a relative to positioning is. So if we set it on this and then have an after effect, and we do that by adding the after keyword and then a semicolon, we can set the after effect to absolute. We can also set the after to a background of green 300. We could say after inset 0. Equally, you can specify top, bottom, left, right individually. And so you can kind of see how the pseudo element effect works in Tailwind, and it's just by adding the specific one, so it's either before or after, and then the keyword that applies to that particular pseudo element. So if I just go like this, we should indeed get the green box coming up, which is cool, and I can go after Z0, and that will put it to the back. At least it would if these had Z indexes. So here I can say Z10, And I can add a Z10 here too. So now that brings them both on top. And what I could also do is say after blur, and that's just going to blur out that background specifically. And so just like that, you can add pseudo elements. We could do the exact same thing with a before. So let's just say we copy all of this, paste it in here, swap out all of these keywords for before. Now we can have a before element, but let's, instead of setting the inset to 0, we're going to set the top. We're actually going to set a negative top effect. So we're going to go negative top 10. And we're going to go before negative left 10, just like that. And then we will also say background blue 300, just like that. And now, since we've not set the right and bottom properties, we have to add a width and height. So we'll just say before height full, before, I'm going to spell that correctly, before width full. And now you can see that we get both of these buttons here, and we have these pseudo elements that act in the background. If I then go and remove the relative keyword, we can see that they shift. So that's the importance of specifying what these absolute elements are positioned relative to. And it's this parent container. The last thing that's worth mentioning about these pseudo effects is that you can also even add a content. So I could say in here, after content dash string hello, and that does indeed pop up on the screen. So there's heaps of things you can do with the pseudo effects. The next one is the breakpoints. Now, breakpoints are absolutely critical for your design, and typically the best way to implement breakpoints is to design for a responsive mobile design first. So, you know, this is probably pretty appropriate. And then as your screen gets bigger, then have a secondary set of styles. And the way that we can achieve this is by using these breakpoints here. So currently, let's say I have this one button here, and let's say I wanted to duplicate this. So now I have two of them, and I'm going to change these colors from green and blue to amber and rose. So now we can see I have all these buttons here, just like that. And for a mobile device, it actually makes sense to have them both column, because if we were to go and remove this, they would just overflow the page like that, and that looks absolutely gross. So what we can do is design for a mobile device first by having that in here, and then we can add the breakpoint and specify the design that we want, or the layout that we want, or the style that we want when we exceed that breakpoint. So now when we're on a greater than small screen, which is approximately 640 pixels, and small and medium is typically the breakpoint that I'll use, most commonly small. Now what we can do is we can say flex row, and that will use this flex row style instead of the flex column when we go on a bigger screen. So there you can see it swapping just like that. And so just like that, we've incorporated breakpoint design styles in our screen, and it's just going to be, well, actually you can see there's still a bit of overflow. So perhaps in this particular case, we want it to be a medium screen. And now when we do finally reach that breakpoint, we're not actually going to be overflowing. But what we could also do is, if we just set that back to small, we can add another one, and let's just say we want to change the background. So we'll go background slate 900, and we'll also change the text color to text white on a bigger screen. And so on the small screen, we're going to have that flex column and our original styles. And then as we go bigger, we can see that it transitions and we get these new styles being applied. And we can see that the text color has changed, because if I have an H1 here that says hello, that is indeed white. And then if we come back down here, it goes to the original color. So now the next one is how you can have a custom input. And the example is here, we have this hello. We can come in here and add a class name and say text slate 900. Now that's going to change that here, and I'm also just going to push everything down by adding a margin bottom of 24. So now we have this text color. However, this is using a Tailwind default color, and for a majority of cases, these colors are sufficient, and they're actually pretty concise, which can make it really easy to build nice applications because you don't overcomplicate the color schemes. But if we did want to add a unique style or a custom style, what we can do is use the square parentheses, and that tells Tailwind that we're going to be inputting our own value. And so in this particular case, I could use a hex code, and I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can see that that only just changed the color a little bit. If I go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just like that, we get a slightly brown. If I go E, we get a light gray. And if I go 1, 1, just like that, we get blue. And so the moral of the story is that we can, for example, even come in here and we could say, traditionally text XL will change the font size. Now what we can do is say 100 rem custom, and it's just going to absolutely blow up. So it's really good to know how to add in these custom inputs for the cases where maybe you need to specify something that's not default. And just for one more example, I might just add a border. So now we can see a border around our element, and let's say we had a padding of 10, and now if I wanted to add a padding of 11, it still works, but if I wanted to add one of 23, it doesn't know how to recognize it because that's not a default element. And so instead what I could just say 200, or maybe it's like 54 pixels, whatever it is, whatever that unit might be. Now we can just specify it however we want. We can go 107.5, and it will do exactly that. The next one on our list is dynamic inputs, and dynamic inputs are really good for examples where in React we have state. So let's say I have here theme and set theme. And let's just say by default it's equal to use state false. And now obviously we're going to have to import use state from React, just like that. And let's say this button has an on-click event that sets theme to the inverse of theme. So if I were to console.log this and say on this particular button, we would be able to see that theme would constantly be updating. So if I just come across here and inspect this page, let's say we go to the console, if I refresh, we can see it's false. And now every time I do it, it inverses the state of the theme. And now let's say we wanted this to be dark mode or light mode. What we could do is, instead of having these breakpoints here where we specify the color, we can actually make it a dynamic string, and this works for most, well, I would go ahead and say every JavaScript framework. You can go ahead and add a curly brace to perform some JavaScript logic on the string before applying it to the class name. We can add a space in there, and now we can construct our own string. And so here I could say theme, and if it's true, which might mean that, dark mode is enabled, I can say background slate 900, text white, and then I can set an otherwise property that just says background white, or actually let's say yellow 200 and text maybe violet 700. And so now when I save that and I click this, we can see that we get to inverse the theme, and we're adding dynamic properties using JavaScript. And as I kind of mentioned, this will work for any JavaScript framework, and it's just really important to know. And you can actually use the same concept to, let's say you import styles from a particular module. Let's say you have app.styles, app.module.css, and let's say this was your div style. We can once again go ahead and add a space here. You have to make sure that there's spaces between everything, and so we could even just add an empty space to ensure that it works. And now we can add styles.container, or whatever the style might be that you originally had applied to this div will now be combined with your Tailwind styles. And so that's really important if you're migrating from one system to another, that you can use them together and, add more or less styles here, add more or less styles here. Obviously you don't want them to conflict, but you can combine two systems in one using this dynamic system where you use these curly parentheses around the outside. So that's obviously not going to work because we actually don't have a style sheet. So I will just remove that. But now we have a theme working. We can look at animations. So obviously here we looked at how we can add a particular animation here. If you go into the documentation, and let's just for the minute remove this hello, we have the second button here. And what if we wanted to have a different animation? Well, now what we can do is actually just use ping, and that's actually not correct. It's animate ping, and there's a number of them. And so now when we hover over it, it's going to have these default styles or animations that you don't actually have to custom code. Another one is spin. and there's heaps of them listed in their documentation. So now we have a rotate and now we have a spin, and they're just, you know, if you had a loading symbol that was circular, we can actually add a border radius of 50% here by saying border radius full, and we could actually go even harder and just say relative after absolute after inset, let's say 4 after has a background of inherit from the parent. Well, actually, let's go ahead and say white. Okay, that's too much of an inset. Let's just say inset 1, just like that. And let's also say after is rounded full. And then let's use the before to have another element. So let's say that's absolute before white, background white, before height, full, before width, let's say it's 2, before top 4, before left 1/2, and I'll center it by just saying before minus translate x 1/2. So now we can see that that hops out the bottom, and so if I just say overflow hidden on the parent element, that will hide it. And so now it kind of looks like we have a circular ring. And so now what happens is we get, you know, it's obviously a very terrible little loading bar, but you can see that that spin is actually working. You could very comfortably, just using these pseudo effects and these animations, make a really cool loading spinner. So next we have flex and grid. And so up here we've kind of demonstrated how you can use flex. However, grid is actually a very amazing system that you definitely want to be familiar with. And so instead of using this flex logic just here, what I can instead do is achieve the same thing. So obviously this is just going to display on my page just here. I can say grid, so that's obviously going to default grid everything. And now the default grid is 1 column, so everything is obviously in 1 column. And I can say grid cols 2, and now everything is perfectly separated into 2 columns. And so, you know, you can obviously vary this to make it 3, or I could say 1, and on small, specify it to grid cols 2. And so on a small screen, they'll be stacked, and then on a bigger screen, they come out into 2 columns. You know, we could make that 3, and it will have an overflow, whatever that may look like. But understanding just this simple system here is a very effective way to quickly come up with grid layouts. And we can even come into the children element and say col span 2, for example. And now this element is going to span 2 of those parent columns, but that obviously doesn't make any sense if it's on a small screen. So we can say that's only on anything bigger than a small screen. And now in our small mobile responsive sizes, it works perfectly, and it scales up to take up 2/3 as opposed to the 1 for the other. And finally, we have hidden versus inline, where inline can actually be replaced with any other kind of display, so flex or grid. And what that is useful for is if we set a default here of hidden, now we have this hidden, or the element is essentially gone, to be honest. And maybe that's a bad example. Let's instead use the span here. Let's say the spans are both hidden on smaller screens. So just like that, hidden. And so they're not there. And if we come down to these small screen sizes, they don't exist. But what we can do is use these breakpoints again to just say inline, or you can use flex, whatever you prefer. And now when we go up to a big screen, we get elements coming onto the page. I need to make sure that's the right one. The span is hidden. Small, we want inline, which is the default. And now when we size up, we can see that the did work on this one, didn't work on this one. And that's actually just because it's probably overflowing the page. So instead what I will do is remove the col span 2 just here, and also set that back to 2. And now you can see that these button icons do indeed show up. So just like that, you can also see how you can completely remove elements on a smaller screen and have them crop up on a bigger screen. But just like that, we've covered 8 of the more complicated, and honestly, it's probably the top level complexity events that you're going to come in contact with Tailwind. They're super great to add into your Tailwind tool belt, and it should really unlock a whole lot of amazing designs that you can really build super quickly and efficiently with Tailwind. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and sub. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you learned something, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.